This is Lisa from Mobile Tech Review, and now we're looking at the 2021 14-inch MacBook Pro. I already reviewed the 16-inch version of the M1 MacBook Pro. So, I know some folks reviewed both of them together, and there are a lot of overlapping similarities, but there's also some key differences, so I thought I would do them separately. Is this as great as you might think? Well, probably so, but we're going to find out now. So the 14 inch is obviously a new size for Apple. They haven't made a 14-inch laptop in I don't know how long, but 14-inch is the new 13-inch. Now that we have smaller bezels, you get a bigger screen and what used to be the footprint of a 13-inch laptop. In fact, the footprint is not so much bigger compared to the 13-inch M1 MacBook Pro. This is, however, a little thicker and a little bit heavier. And that's the thing here when I say the difference between the 14 and the 16-inch. There's some overlap probably for some of you trying to decide, should you get the 13-inch MacBook Pro or the 14-inch? But probably nobody's thinking, should I get a 13-inch or a 16-inch? You see what I mean? Different use cases, different competing laptops. And we'll talk about some of the competitors too, including performance and other metrics. So you probably know by now, this is a big overhaul for Apple. We have the M1 Pro and the M1 Max processors inside using Apple's system-on-chip unified architecture here. So the RAM and the SSD storage are all part of the chip, which is part of what allows it to be radically fast, not unlike the M1 MacBook Air and 13-inch MacBook Pro. It's astounding. And that also means it's very power efficient, which we saw again with the Air and the 13-inch MacBook Pro. And that also means it runs a lot cooler and a lot quieter, which is what you want from a laptop, right? The idea is it's supposed to not burn you. It's supposed to run for a decent amount of hours on battery, all that sort of stuff. And those are the things we've kind of foregone with a lot of laptops over the years. Okay, I'm not pointing fingers at Intel and all that, but you know what I mean. What else can we say about this new Mac? You get a mini LED display, which is an OLED-like technology in terms of contrast, black levels, brightness and contrast, all that good stuff display here. You also get the notch, which to be honest does look dorky. And I do suspect that Apple wanted to include Face ID and there was part shortage and they couldn't do it, and that's why we have it. It is a 1080p high quality webcam, so nowadays with everybody video conferencing, that is nice to have, and the usual 3-mic system for picking up high quality audio. But the good thing about the notch is, if you can say there's a good thing about the notch, is that it's still a 16:10 aspect ratio display, and the notch and the menu bar live above that. So you're not losing any of that 16:10 real estate. The resolution on this is pretty high. It's not quite 4K resolution, but for a 14-inch display, I think it's perfectly acceptable. It's the usual wide gamut P3, well calibrated at the factory, and 500 nits in brightness in your standard use mode and standard definition, like on the desktop, and it can do 1600 nits in HDR mode, including if you're playing video in a window. That window can be HDR while your desktop is still SDR. It's pretty neat stuff. Anyway, it's gorgeous. There's not much blooming, which means white text or objects on a black background don't show much light blooming around the white stuff. It's sweet. And that's one of the things that sets it apart from the 13-inch MacBook Pro, which has a conventional IPS display, not mini LED. So certainly not as gorgeous looking. There's no fancy HDR mode, all that sort of thing. So a little more pro. What else is pro here are the ports. So I can imagine Apple's kind of laughing, right? So many PC manufacturers went and sort of copied them and said, okay, we'll just have USB-C Thunderbolt 3 ports, right? Or Thunderbolt 4. Well, Apple now has brought back the legacy ports. So for pro people, for example, the M1 13-inch MacBook Pro can only drive one external display. With this one, you can go up to 4, just like the 16-inch. You can have 3 6K plus a 4K display. It's all at 60 hertz. It's crazy. You've got an HDMI 2.0 port. You have 3 Thunderbolt 4 ports, USB-C style connector. One less, but that's okay because we now have a separate MagSafe connector for charging, so you're not using one of those to charge anymore. And we have a UHS SD card slot. UHS 2. And not very fast as it's available, but I'll take it. It's wonderful. For creative pros, you got your cameras, you got your SD cards, and you have a 3.5mm headphone jack, of course, that supports high impedance headphones for you audiophiles out there. So the ports and stuff and the external monitor support, this is more what pros want. So that sets it apart from the 13-inch MacBook Pro right there. Having nothing to do with Pro or not Pro, the Touch Bar is gone. If you like the Touch Bar, the 13-inch still has that for you, but the 14-inch and the 16-inch do not. So you have an FN row up top with your physical escape key, your brightness controls being buttons again, and all that sort of thing. I'm fine with that. I was not a huge Touch Bar fan, so it's gone here, RIP. You still have that Touch ID fingerprint scanner, and no longer will you get any indicator that tell you when you need to press it, since there is no, well, Touch Bar with graphical display on it, but other than that, its Magic Keyboard is fine. I mean, for those of you who are used to it, I still don't appreciate how low travel it is at 0.9 millimeters, but it is very tactile, very crisp, scissor keys, the reliable kind, butterfly keyboard, long gone, and all that sort of thing. It's once you get used to the travel on it, it's actually nice to type on. And the trackpad is still the same giant haptic trackpad that's class leading here. So that stuff's good. Not much different from your 13-inch in that respect, that trackpad. So like I said, we have that MagSafe 3 connector now. So there's two different power chargers. If you get the base model of the 14-inch MacBook Pro, you get a 67 watt hour. If you get anything but the very base model, then you get a 96 watt hour charger, which supports fast charging. So 50% charge in a half an hour, which is pretty darn fast. And MagSafe, the good thing, you kick the cord, you're not going to pull the laptop off the coffee table, that sort of thing. If you do need to fall back on USB-C charging, you can do that as well. Now let's talk about performance. It almost exactly parallels the 16-inch models that are reviewed, Pro and Max. Now here we only have the Pro base model because I figured that's the one that's sufficiently different from the other two. Watch my 16-inch review if you want to hear about the more powerful Pro and Max configurations. So the base model is $2,000 here, and that starts with an 8-core CPU, 6 performance cores, 2 efficiency cores, and a 14-core GPU, all integrated system on chip. So that's a little bit different. Every other 14-inch model, as you go up the food chain in price, and with all of the 16 inches, those are 10-core CPUs with 8 performance cores and 2 efficiency cores. So as you might guess, if you go with the base model, you're not going to get quite as much CPU performance here. Still going to be faster than a 13-inch MacBook Pro, which has 4 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores. And just like the 16-inch model, if you want to go to the Max model, that's where you're going to get more GPU cores. After you step up from the base model, you can still get a Pro with the same number, 10-core CPU. But if you want to move up to the 24 or the 32-core GPU for your creative professionals who are doing a lot of video editing, for example, or 3D rendering, then you move up to the Max processor model. Now for RAM, you can get the Pro with either 16 or 32 gigabytes of memory. With the Max, you can get it with 32 or 64 gigabytes of memory. So that's a lot of data, and that's great. Here's a little bit more data though. So for RAM, again, part of the system on chip. So everything is soldered, and it's not even literally soldered. It's part of one big chip. The base model has 16 gigs of RAM, and if you want to go higher than that, you can go up to 64 max. For the storage, 512 gigs is a starting, and you can go all the way up to 8 terabytes, so you're going to pay God through the nose for that 8 terabytes. So probably most of you are going to use external storage on this Thunderbolt, USB-C, whatever you want to do with that. So that's a lot of data, right? What does this mean to you? If you're just liking the MacBook Pro 14-inch model because you want to hook up external monitors, a couple of them instead of just one, then you can go with the lowest end configuration. You don't have great demands. You do everyday office work, even if you're, doing Photoshop and Lightroom and all that sort of thing, not as a working creative professional who triages 1,000 photos a week or something like that, but like us, a lot of normal people do, right? You edit photos, you edit some video that you took with your iPhone or any other device. The base model is actually fine. I mean, let's face it, the M1 Air and 13-inch MacBook Pro were very performant. If you're somebody who's doing coding and you're doing smaller projects or you're doing it for school, the base model is just fine for you, honestly. You might even be able to make do with a 13-inch MacBook Pro. But for those of you who are coding commercially for bigger companies and you have millions of lines of code, that's when you're starting to say, I should move up to that amazingly fast, beats the pants off of any PC processor, 10-core CPU model, which starts at $2,500. So you go up $500, it's probably worth it for that. if you're a video editor and you're looking for something small to take with you instead of a 16-inch MacBook Pro, I mean, I get that. The 16-inch MacBook Pro is 4.8 pounds. This one is 3.5 pounds, which is 1.6 kilograms. It is an easier carry. Then certainly consider the 24-core or the 32-core GPU. If you're working with 4K footage, multiple streams, or even 8K and that sort of thing, you'll get nearly the same performance as on the 16-inch. The only limiting factor here is smaller chassis, less room to dissipate heat. But honestly, this one, doing the Cinebench R23 test, which is our favorite test to get any laptop overheating and throttling and cutting back on its performance, this one still can do Cinebench R23 multi-core, multiple rounds of that long test, and maintain 90 degrees centigrade core temperatures. That's when the fans kick on, around 90 degrees, just like the 16-inch. So, yeah. It's pretty impressive in terms of thermals. Let's talk a little more about those thermals. When doing things like working in Final Cut Pro with multiple 4K streams and not even ProRes footage, which is more efficient, but less efficient codecs and all that sort of thing, this typically, even doing exports, the cores are in the 50 to 60 centigrade range for temperature. That's great. The 16-inch will stay a little cooler. It pretty much just stays at 50 to 53 centigrade. So, yeah. This can handle anything. You won't hear the fans much. When they do kick on, they're not loud. Typically, they're anywhere from 1,500 RPMs to 2,400 RPMs. It doesn't get burning hot. It's really darn impressive. It's nice stuff. So what about battery life then? That's another part of this efficiency thing, right? Battery life is pretty good. Not as good as the 13-inch MacBook Pro. So again, for those of you who are trying to decide, if your needs are not super heavyweight and particularly not needing that way extra cores for the GPU, this one Apple claims around 11 hours of actual real-world use and 17 hours if you're streaming Apple TV. In my tests, actually doing real-world tests, which took forever, because let me tell you, you can surf in Safari for a long time before that ever budges from 100% charge. I was getting about 11 hours at 200 nits of brightness, multiple tabs in Safari going, doing some Photoshop editing, some Slack, some Zoom calls, all that sort of stuff, office work, all the productivity and a little bit of creative work, but not spending my entire day in Final Cut. The amazing thing is, if you are doing Final Cut or even Adobe Premiere, where this holds up well and actually exceeds some high-performance Intel Core i7 and Core i9 gaming laptops, even there you'll get most of your performance. Apple doesn't throttle back as much as Windows PC makers do. And I can actually edit on this 14-inch for about 5.5 hours in Final Cut on a charge without even trying, without even dropping my brightness below my comfort level, which is about 300 nits and all that sort of thing. It's superb, really is. Now, one thing to note about battery life is I would expect an hour shorter runtimes with the Max processor. This is based on my testing of the 16-inch with the Pro and the Max processors. On the bigger Mac, there's a little bit more of a delta, but so far from what I've heard and seen, it's going to be about an hour shorter runtime for your 14-inch if you go with the Max processor. So while we're talking about PC laptops and comparisons, you saw the graphs that were going across the screen there. It's highly performant. If you look particularly at the 10-core CPU model, it's going to beat everybody in Geekbench 5. It's going to beat in terms of code compilation times, even if you're looking at something like Alienware X17, okay? We're talking very powerful laptops here. So despite the fact that it's that small, it is almost uniquely positioned in terms of its performance. Besides the 13-inch MacBook Pro at the low end as a competitor, there's also, well, Surface Laptop Studio. Now, for creatives who want the touchscreen and want the pen, it's a no-brainer. The Surface Laptop Studio is a lovely machine, and it's for you. In terms of CPU performance, that Surface laptop has only a 4-core i7 CPU, so not nearly as fast. And it has an RTX 3050 Ti Max-Q. And honestly, similar performance to a bit less depending on the task you're doing. If you're doing DaVinci Resolve or Premiere or Final Cut or something like that, well, obviously not Final Cut in the PC, the Mac will win. But for gaming, which is another topic, well, the Surface laptop still has an advantage because it has NVIDIA graphics. Then there's the Asus ROG Zephyrus G14 with the RTX 3050 Ti inside and a Ryzen processor, which is more power efficient and a bit cooler running than an Intel. So that one's $2,000 too, and that one is actually a good competitor in terms of performance. Again, that has good battery life, but not as good. You're going to get a higher quality display here. You're going to get better CPU performance, surprisingly, because I love Ryzen, but in terms of things like code compilation times and even performance inside of Adobe Premiere than that. So there are your direct competitors, and Apple's holding its own, except for when it comes to gaming. Why? Because this is an ARM architecture. This does not support Boot Camp into Windows. You've got Parallels, which is a VM, virtual machine, and it's ARM. So you're going to run Windows ARM version. And then if you're trying to run an x86 game from Steam or something like that, or GOG, or wherever you get your games from, then Windows is going to handle that virtualization over to x86, and it's just not high performance for that sort of thing. So not so much. I mean, you can use Mac Steam games that are going to run under Rosetta. Little performance penalty there, not as much, but this is just not really a machine for gaming. And it's just an x86 world for gaming right now. So that's the 14-inch MacBook Pro with M1 processors for 2021, and Apple has done it again, just like with the 16-inch model. It's an amazingly high-performance yet compact and good-looking machine that actually brings back some useful ports, has a stunning mini LED display that holds this again against OLED, has very good battery life, runs cool, runs quiet, all those things that you want from a laptop in a portable package. I'm Lisa from Mobile Tech Review. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more cool tech videos, and be sure to hit the notification bell so you know about them.